They called him a failure, a bankrupt nobody, a man not worth a second glance. So when her powerful family forced her to marry him, they believed they were throwing her life away, closing the door on her future without a second thought. But what they didn't know was that this so-called worthless man was carrying a truth so carefully hidden, so deliberately concealed, that once revealed, it would unravel everything they thought they controlled. And by the time they began to understand what they had done, by the time regret finally reached them, it was already too late, because some decisions don't just change lives, they rewrite destinies in ways no one can undo. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the quiet suburbs just outside Chicago, the Halston family had built a name that carried weight in every room it entered, a reputation forged through decades of calculated business moves, strategic alliances, and an unwavering belief that status defined worth. To outsiders, they were the model of success, a family that had climbed to the top and intended to stay there. But within the walls of their sprawling estate, decisions were rarely about love or loyalty. They were about leverage, about positioning, about ensuring that every connection served a purpose. And when it came to their daughters, those expectations were no different. Every choice, every introduction, every opportunity was carefully measured against one question: how does this benefit the family name? Vanessa Halston understood that better than anyone. As the eldest daughter, she had been raised to believe that her future was not her own, but an extension of the family's ambition. She carried herself with confidence, spoke with precision, and made it clear that she had no intention of settling for anything less than power. To her, marriage was not about companionship, it was about elevation, about aligning herself with someone who could take her even higher. So when her father announced that she would be marrying a man named Adrian Cole, a name that no longer held the influence it once did, she didn't hesitate to reject the idea outright. In her eyes, Adrian was a liability, a reminder of a fallen empire that had no place in her carefully planned future. But the Halston family was not known for backing down from decisions made by those who came before them, and this arrangement had been set in motion long before Vanessa had the chance to object. Years earlier, in a time when the Cole family still commanded respect, a promise had been made, an agreement between two patriarchs who believed their union would strengthen both families for generations to come. That promise had outlived its usefulness in Vanessa's mind, but to her father, it was still binding, a matter of honor that could not simply be dismissed. Breaking it outright would raise questions, and questions were dangerous in a world where perception was everything. So instead, they found another solution, one that allowed them to honor the letter of the agreement while quietly reshaping its outcome. If the arrangement required a Halston daughter to marry Adrian Cole, it didn't specify which one. And that is how the decision was made to send Harper Halston in her sister's place, the younger daughter who had spent most of her life in the shadows of the family she was born into. Harper was different, not because she lacked intelligence or awareness, but because she had never been fully accepted into the version of the family that Vanessa represented. Where Vanessa was polished, Harper was overlooked, treated more like an afterthought than an heir. When Harper received the call to return home, she already sensed that something was wrong. She had learned long ago that sudden invitations from her family rarely came with good intentions. And when she stepped into the grand living room and saw Adrian Cole standing there, calm and composed despite the tension surrounding him, she understood immediately that this wasn't a request. It was a decision that had already been made. The way Vanessa looked at him, the way her parents avoided Harper's gaze, it all pointed to a single conclusion that no one had the decency to say out loud. The wedding itself was less a celebration and more a performance, a carefully orchestrated event designed to maintain appearances while quietly shifting responsibility onto Harper's shoulders. There were no genuine smiles, no heartfelt congratulations, only polite gestures and veiled remarks that made it clear how little anyone thought of the union. When Adrian presented his gifts, items of considerable value to anyone who understood their worth, they were dismissed as insignificant, laughed off as if they were nothing more than cheap tokens from a man who had nothing left to offer. And through it all, Adrian said very little, his expression unchanged, as if he were observing something that had already played out in his mind long before it happened. For Harper, the transition was immediate and absolute. One moment she was part of a family that barely acknowledged her existence, and the next she was being sent away to build a life with a man she barely knew, in a home that stood in stark contrast to everything she had grown up around. The house Adrian brought her to was modest, almost understated, but it carried a sense of quiet stability that felt more genuine than anything she had experienced before. There were no grand displays, no unnecessary luxuries, just a space that seemed untouched by the need to impress anyone. What surprised her most was not the house, but Adrian himself. He didn't behave like a man who had lost everything, nor did he carry the bitterness she expected from someone who had been so publicly humiliated. Instead, there was a calmness to him, a level of control that didn't quite align with the image her family had painted. When she offered to support them both, believing she was stepping into the role of provider, he didn't argue or correct her. He simply accepted it with a faint smile that suggested there was more he wasn't saying. As days turned into weeks, Harper began to notice small details that didn't add up. The way certain calls were taken in private, the way people seemed to recognize Adrian even when he made no effort to introduce himself, the way situations that should have caused problems seemed to resolve themselves without explanation. None of it was obvious enough to form a clear picture, but it was enough to plant a question in her mind, a quiet doubt that maybe the story she had been told about him wasn't entirely true. At the same time, her own life was becoming more complicated. Working as a junior reporter, Harper saw an opportunity to prove herself when news broke that one of the most powerful executives in the country, the elusive head of a company known for its influence and secrecy, might finally be open to an interview. It was the kind of story that could change her career overnight, the kind of chance that didn't come twice. And as she pursued it with determination, she had no idea how closely her path was already intertwined with the very person she was trying to reach. Because while Harper was searching for answers, Adrian was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the truth to reveal itself in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. He had allowed the world to underestimate him, to reduce him to a version of himself that no longer reflected reality, and in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable than reputation. He had gained control over when and how the truth would come out. And when it did, it wouldn't just change how people saw him, it would force them to confront everything they thought they knew about power, about worth, and about the cost of judging a man before understanding who he really is. Who was this man? Really? That question lingered long after the wedding guests had left and the whispers had settled into silence, because nothing about Adrian Cole quite matched the version of him that had been presented so confidently by the Halston family. Why did he accept a marriage built on humiliation, standing there without protest as his name was reduced, his worth dismissed, his past rewritten into something small enough for others to feel comfortable looking down on? And most importantly, what would happen when the truth finally came out, when every assumption made about him was forced into the light and measured against reality? The answers to those questions were not simple, and they were not immediate, but they were already shaping events in ways no one in that room could see. To understand Adrian Cole, you have to look beyond the version of him that the Halstons chose to believe, beyond the narrative of collapse and failure that had been repeated often enough to sound like fact. There was a time when the Cole name carried a different kind of weight, when it was spoken with the same respect the Halstons now demanded for themselves. But influence does not disappear overnight, and power, when built carefully, rarely vanishes completely. It shifts, it adapts, and sometimes it hides, waiting for the right moment to return in a form that no one expects. Adrian had lived through that transition not as a victim of it, but as someone who understood exactly what needed to be sacrificed in order to gain something far greater in the long run. For the Halstons, however, perception was everything, and perception told them that Adrian was no longer a threat, no longer relevant, no longer worthy of consideration beyond fulfilling an old obligation. That belief gave them confidence, the kind of confidence that leads people to act without caution, to speak without restraint, to reveal more about themselves than they intend. And Adrian noticed all of it. Every dismissive glance, every careless remark, every decision made under the assumption that he was powerless added another layer to his understanding of the family he had just married into. He wasn't reacting, he wasn't defending himself, he was observing, collecting, and waiting. Harper, caught in the middle of all of this, saw only fragments of the truth, pieces that didn't quite fit together but were impossible to ignore. She saw a man who had every reason to be bitter yet showed none of it. A man who accepted her support without pride getting in the way, but who never seemed dependent on it either. There were moments, brief and subtle, when his composure shifted just enough to reveal something deeper, something controlled and deliberate that made her question everything she had been told. It wasn't enough to form a conclusion, but it was enough to create doubt, and doubt has a way of growing when left unanswered. At the same time, the Halston family continued forward as if nothing had changed, focusing on their business interests, their partnerships, their plans for the future. They believed they had contained the situation, redirected it, turned a potential problem into a manageable outcome. Vanessa moved on quickly, aligning herself with new opportunities, new connections, still determined to secure a position that matched her ambitions. To her, Adrian Cole was already part of the past, a situation resolved and no longer worth her attention. But what she didn't realize was that the situation hadn't ended. It had only shifted, and the consequences of that shift were already beginning to unfold in ways she couldn't yet see. Because this wasn't just a marriage, it was the beginning of a quiet takeover, one that wouldn't be announced with grand gestures or immediate confrontation, but with small, precise moves that would gradually alter the balance of power. Adrian didn't need to prove anything to the Halstons in words, he only needed time, and with every passing day, that time was bringing him closer to a moment when the truth would no longer be something he carried alone, but something the entire family would be forced to face. In their world, power wasn't earned. It was protected, guarded carefully behind polished smiles, strategic alliances, and a reputation that had been built over decades and could be destroyed in a single misstep. The Halston family understood this better than most. Their name opened doors, influenced decisions, and shaped outcomes long before negotiations even began. Every partnership they entered was calculated, every relationship weighed against its potential benefit, and every risk assessed with one priority in mind: preserving the image they had worked so hard to maintain. Their connection to one of the most powerful corporations in the country, a company known quietly in business circles as Nebula Group, was not just an opportunity, it was a lifeline to even greater influence. Losing that connection was not an option, and everything they did revolved around ensuring it remained intact. Within that carefully constructed world, Vanessa Halston stood as the embodiment of everything the family valued. She was ambitious in a way that left no room for hesitation, confident in her ability to navigate any situation, and completely aligned with the belief that her future should elevate the family's position even further. She didn't believe in love the way most people did, not as something spontaneous or emotional, but as something strategic, something that could be used to secure power and stability. To her, marriage was not about building a life with someone, it was about aligning with the right person at the right time, someone who could match or exceed the level she intended to reach. Becoming the wife of a powerful executive, possibly even the elusive head of Nebula Group, was not just a dream, it was an expectation she had set for herself, and she had no intention of letting anything or anyone stand in the way of that. Harper Halston, on the other hand, had grown up in the same house but under entirely different circumstances. Where Vanessa was groomed for prominence, Harper was often overlooked, her presence acknowledged only when necessary, her opinions rarely given the same weight. She learned early on that she existed on the edges of a family that prioritized appearances over connection, and while she never openly challenged that reality, she never fully accepted it either. There was a quiet resilience in her, a determination to build something of her own, even if it meant stepping outside the expectations that had been placed on her. She wanted independence, not just financially but emotionally, and beneath that desire was another question that had never been answered: the truth about her parents' past, a truth that no one in the family seemed willing to discuss. She wasn't their first choice when it came to anything important, and when the time came to fulfill the arrangement with Adrian Cole, she became their last option, the one sent forward to resolve a situation no one else wanted to handle. And then there was Adrian Cole, the man at the center of it all, presented to the world as the fallen heir of a once powerful family, someone who had lost everything and was now living in the shadow of what used to be. That was the version people accepted, the version that made it easy to dismiss him, to underestimate him, to treat him as insignificant. But that version was incomplete. Beneath the surface, Adrian was calm in a way that didn't match his supposed circumstances, observant in a way that suggested he was always paying attention, always processing more than he revealed. He had already lost everything once, or at least that's what they believed, and that belief gave him an advantage no one seemed to recognize. Because when people assume you have nothing left, they stop looking for what you might still be holding on to. There were moments, subtle and easy to overlook, when that hidden side of Adrian became just visible enough to raise questions. The way he carried himself in situations where others might have shown discomfort, the way conversations seemed to shift slightly in his presence, the way certain names, particularly Nebula Group, seemed to hold a significance that went beyond casual mention. He never reacted the way people expected him to, never defended himself against insults, never tried to prove his worth in ways that would have satisfied those judging him. Instead, he watched, listened, and allowed events to unfold, as if he already knew how they would play out. And while the Halstons continued to move forward with their plans, confident in their control over the situation, they failed to notice the pattern forming beneath the surface. Small details, minor interactions, moments that didn't seem important on their own were beginning to connect in ways that pointed to something much larger. Adrian wasn't just adapting to his new position, he was positioning himself, carefully and deliberately, for something that had yet to be revealed. And by the time those around him began to see the full picture, it wouldn't be a matter of stopping him, it would be a matter of understanding how they had missed it for so long. The day of the wedding arrived with a level of precision that made it clear this was never meant to be a celebration. It was an obligation being fulfilled in the most controlled way possible. Guests gathered not out of joy, but out of curiosity, drawn by the quiet rumors surrounding the Halston family's decision and the unexpected appearance of Adrian Cole. Conversations were measured, glances were exchanged, and beneath the surface of polite smiles was a shared understanding that something about this union didn't feel right. When Adrian stepped forward with the gifts he had prepared, items chosen with care and intention, they were dismissed almost immediately, reduced to symbols of inadequacy rather than gestures of sincerity. The room carried a subtle tension, one that grew heavier with every passing moment as the imbalance between the two families became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a wedding. It was a transaction. Vanessa made no effort to hide her disapproval, her words sharp enough to cut through the carefully maintained atmosphere, her tone making it clear that she viewed the entire situation as beneath her. To her, Adrian represented everything she refused to become, a step backward when she had spent her life moving forward. And when she finally made her refusal undeniable, rejecting him openly and without hesitation, the shift in the room was immediate. What had been a controlled event quickly turned into something far less predictable, forcing the Halston family to act faster than they had planned. But rather than admit defeat, they adapted, redirecting the arrangement toward Harper with a level of ease that revealed just how little her position had ever mattered to them. What followed was not just a decision, it was a sequence of actions designed to remove any possibility of resistance. The betrayal didn't come loudly, it came quietly, in the form of manipulation that left Harper with no clear way to defend herself. A drink offered at the wrong moment, a situation engineered to appear compromising, and suddenly the narrative shifted. Accusations replaced explanations, assumptions replaced truth, and Harper found herself at the center of a story she hadn't written. Vanessa's involvement was subtle enough to avoid direct blame, but deliberate enough to ensure the outcome she wanted. And just like that, her life was rewritten without her consent. The ceremony moved forward with an urgency that left no room for reconsideration. Words were spoken, vows were exchanged, and what should have been a moment of significance felt instead like the closing of a door Harper hadn't even realized was being opened. Adrian remained composed throughout it all, his reaction measured, his silence more telling than any argument could have been. He didn't question the sudden change, didn't challenge the circumstances, didn't expose the truth behind what had just happened. He accepted it, not with defeat, but with a calm that suggested he understood more than he was letting on. When it was over, the contrast between Harper's past and her new reality became immediate. The estate she had grown up in, with its expansive rooms and carefully curated image of success, was replaced by a house that felt almost modest in comparison. There were no grand entrances, No staff moving quietly in the background. No constant reminders of status or wealth. Instead, there was simplicity, a space that functioned without the need to impress anyone. For Harper, the adjustment was both disorienting and strangely grounding, a shift away from the environment that had always defined her but never truly accepted her. She stepped into her new role with a sense of responsibility that had been shaped by years of being underestimated. If this was her life now, she would make it work on her own terms. She took on the role of provider without hesitation, offering support in ways that felt natural to her, determined to build something stable even if it wasn't what she had once imagined. Adrian, for his part, didn't resist this dynamic, but he didn't fully embrace it either. He allowed her to believe she was carrying the weight, while quietly maintaining a distance that suggested he was never entirely dependent on her efforts. For the first time, someone treated him like he was enough. Not because of what he could offer, not because of the name he carried, but simply because of who he was in that moment. And that, more than anything, created a shift neither of them fully understood yet. Harper saw a man who had been wronged, someone who deserved a chance to rebuild, someone worth standing beside even when others turned away. Adrian saw something different, something he hadn't expected to find in a situation that had begun with calculation and control. He saw sincerity, and for a brief moment, it disrupted the carefully constructed distance he had maintained from everything around him. But what she didn't know was that the man she was protecting didn't need saving. In the weeks that followed the wedding, life settled into a routine that, on the surface, seemed ordinary, but beneath it, something far more complex was beginning to take shape. Harper threw herself into her work with a level of focus that came from necessity rather than ambition alone. As a junior reporter, she wasn't given the stories that made headlines. She was given the ones others overlooked, the ones that required persistence without recognition. But for Harper, this was an opportunity, not a limitation. She needed stability, she needed income, and more than that, she needed answers. The unanswered questions surrounding her parents' death had followed her for years, lingering in the background of everything she did. And now, with distance from the Halston family and a sense of independence she had never truly felt before, she began to look at those questions more closely. It was during this time that a new assignment began to circulate within the newsroom, one that immediately caught her attention. The head of Nebula Group, a figure known more through influence than appearance, was rumored to be considering a rare interview. For most reporters, it was an impossible task, something that would be passed around and eventually abandoned. The CEO had built a reputation for remaining out of reach, communicating only through a trusted assistant, never appearing publicly, never allowing direct access. But for Harper, it represented more than just a career opportunity. It was a chance to prove herself, to secure a position that would give her both financial stability and the resources to continue investigating the truth she had been searching for. While Harper pursued leads and prepared herself for the possibility of securing that interview, Adrian moved through his own carefully constructed routine. To the outside world, he had taken on a position that matched the narrative everyone believed about him, working as a security guard within one of Nebula Group's buildings. It was a role that required little attention, one that allowed him to remain present without drawing suspicion. People saw him, but they didn't really see him, not in a way that prompted questions or curiosity. It was exactly the kind of position that made him invisible in plain sight. But there were moments, subtle and easily dismissed, when that invisibility didn't quite hold. The way certain employees responded to him, the brief pauses in conversation when he entered a room, the occasional glance that lingered just a second too long. None of it was enough to raise alarms, but it was enough to suggest that his presence carried more weight than his role implied. Adrian noticed all of it, just as he noticed everything else. He wasn't hiding because he was weak. He was waiting for circumstances to align, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, waiting for the truth to emerge in a way that couldn't be controlled by anyone but him. At home, Harper remained unaware of the full extent of what was unfolding around her. She saw a man trying to rebuild, someone adapting to a life far removed from what he once had, and she responded with a level of care that came naturally to her. She encouraged him, supported him, believed in him in ways no one else had. And in doing so, She unknowingly became part of something much larger than either of them had acknowledged out loud. Because every step she took toward uncovering the truth about Nebula Group, every question she asked, every connection she tried to make, was bringing her closer to a revelation that would change everything she thought she understood. And Adrian knew it. He could see the direction she was moving in, could anticipate the questions before she asked them, could measure the distance between what she believed and what was actually true. He didn't stop her, didn't redirect her, didn't interfere in ways that would alter her path. Instead, he allowed it to continue, understanding that some truths carry more weight when they are discovered rather than revealed. And as Harper moved closer to the answers she had been searching for, the gap between perception and reality was narrowing, bringing both of them toward a moment that could no longer be delayed, waiting for the right moment to flip everything. The moment of confrontation came without warning, in a place where appearances mattered just as much as outcomes, and where the Halston name was expected to command respect without question. Harper had arrived with a purpose, focused on her work, determined to secure even the smallest opportunity to move closer to the interview that could change everything for her. But before she could take another step forward, she heard a voice she recognized immediately, a tone layered with confidence and dismissal, the kind that had followed her for most of her life. Vanessa. The timing wasn't accidental, and neither was the setting. Vanessa stood surrounded by people who mattered, people whose opinions shaped outcomes, and she made no effort to lower her voice when she noticed Harper standing there beside Adrian. The remarks started subtly, framed as observations rather than direct insults, but the meaning behind them was clear enough. Vanessa questioned Harper's choices, her judgment, her decision to remain tied to a man she had already written off as insignificant. And then her attention shifted fully to Adrian, her words losing any pretense of politeness as she reduced him to a version of himself that suited her narrative. Low class. The phrase hung in the air longer than it should have, drawing attention from those nearby, reinforcing the image she wanted everyone to accept. It wasn't just an insult, it was a statement meant to define him in front of an audience that mattered. Harper felt the weight of it immediately, not because she believed it, but because she understood what it was meant to do. It was meant to remind her of her place, to reinforce the idea that she had chosen wrong, that she had settled for less, that she should feel the consequences of stepping outside the expectations set for her. And for a brief moment, the pressure of that expectation threatened to pull her back into the role she had spent so long trying to escape. But Adrian didn't react the way Vanessa expected. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't even acknowledge the insult in a way that would escalate the situation. He remained still, composed, his expression unchanged, as if the words held no power over him at all. What happened next shifted the atmosphere in a way no one had anticipated. A figure approached, someone recognized instantly by those familiar with Nebula Group, the assistant who spoke on behalf of the unseen authority behind the company. His presence alone was enough to quiet conversations, to redirect attention, to remind everyone in the room where true influence lay. He didn't address Adrian directly, didn't acknowledge the tension that had just unfolded. Instead, he turned his attention to Vanessa's companion, a man who had been standing confidently just moments before, secure in his position within the company. The dismissal was immediate, delivered with a level of finality that left no room for argument. His position was terminated on the spot, his access revoked, his standing within the company erased in a matter of seconds. The reasoning was brief, almost secondary to the action itself, but it was enough to make the connection clear. Behavior, character, judgment, none of it aligned with the standards Nebula Group claimed to uphold. And just as quickly, the decision extended beyond the individual, reaching into the Halston family's business dealings with the company. Contracts were reconsidered, partnerships reevaluated, and before anyone had the chance to fully process what was happening, the foundation the Halstons had relied on began to shift beneath them. In seconds, power changed hands. The same room that had just echoed with confidence and control now felt uncertain. The balance altered in a way that no one had prepared for. Vanessa's expression, once so certain, tightened just enough to reveal the crack beneath the surface. The realization that something had gone wrong, something she didn't fully understand. She tried to recover, to question, to push back against a decision that seemed sudden and unjustified. But the response she received was measured and unyielding. The decision stood, and there would be no negotiation. Harper stood at the center of it all, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The sequence of events didn't align with anything she had expected. Why was Adrian being protected in a situation where he should have been dismissed? Why did the assistant of Nebula Group act with such precision, such certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided before the confrontation even began? And more importantly, why did it feel like Adrian wasn't surprised by any of it? The cracks were starting to show. But she still couldn't see the full picture. She looked at him differently in that moment, not with doubt, but with a growing awareness that there was more to him than she had allowed herself to consider. The calmness she had once interpreted as resilience now felt deliberate. The silence she had accepted as humility now carried the weight of something controlled and intentional. Every unanswered question she had pushed aside began to resurface, connecting in ways that made it impossible to ignore what was right in front of her. Because the truth was standing right in front of her. By the time the confrontation at Nebula Group settled into silence, something fundamental had already shifted, not just in the balance of power between the Halston family and the company they depended on, but in the way Harper saw the man standing beside her. The questions she had been quietly carrying were no longer easy to ignore, and the more she tried to rationalize what she had witnessed, the less it made sense within the version of reality she had accepted. Adrian remained as composed as ever, offering no explanation, no clarification, no attempt to guide her toward any conclusion. And that silence, more than anything else, began to feel intentional, as if he understood that whatever came next had to be seen, not told. Days later, after exhausting every formal channel available to her, Harper made a decision that went against protocol but aligned with her instincts. If she couldn't reach the CEO of Nebula Group through requests and approvals, she would find another way, one that placed her directly in the path of the truth she had been circling for weeks. The building itself was familiar by now, its structure, its guarded entrances, its quiet hierarchy of authority all mapped out through observation. But this time, she moved with a different sense of purpose, one shaped not just by ambition, but by the growing certainty that the answers she was looking for were closer than anyone realized. When she reached the executive floor, the atmosphere changed in a way that was difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Conversations softened, movements slowed, and there was a subtle awareness in the air that something significant was about to happen. The assistant she had encountered before acknowledged her presence with a look that carried more understanding than surprise, as if her arrival had been anticipated. There were no questions, no resistance, only a quiet gesture toward a door that had remained closed to everyone else. It was a moment that should have felt like a victory, the culmination of everything she had worked toward, but instead it carried a weight that made her hesitate, if only for a second. Then she stepped inside. The office was not what she expected. It wasn't just the scale or the design, it was the presence within it, a familiarity that didn't belong in a place defined by distance and authority. For a brief moment, her mind struggled to process what her eyes were telling her, the connection forming too quickly and yet not quickly enough to fully understand. There was a detail, a movement, something so unmistakable that it cut through every doubt she had been holding on to. And just as the realization began to take shape, just as the truth stood on the edge of becoming undeniable, everything paused in that single, suspended second. She thought she was chasing the most powerful man in the city. But what if she had already married him? The answer didn't come in words, not yet, but it didn't need to. It was already there, in the way events had unfolded, in the decisions that had been made without explanation, in the quiet authority that had protected Adrian when logic said he should have been exposed. Every moment, every detail, every unanswered question now pointed toward something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. And as Harper stood there, caught between what she believed and what she was beginning to understand, the weight of that realization settled in a way that would change everything moving forward. Sometimes, the people we underestimate the most are the ones holding all the power. And sometimes, the greatest mistake isn't choosing the wrong person. It's failing to see who they really are. So what do you think? If you were in Harper's position, standing at the edge of a truth that could change everything you believed about the person beside you. Would you have trusted Adrian? Or would you have walked away before discovering what was really hidden behind his silence? Because trust, in moments like that, isn't just about believing someone's words. It's about deciding whether you're willing to face what those words might reveal. And Harper didn't just stumble into a secret. She was led to it, step by step, without ever realizing how close she had been from the very beginning. Now imagine this for a moment. Everything you thought you understood about someone begins to shift all at once. Every memory, every conversation, every quiet detail suddenly takes on a new meaning. Would you feel betrayed? Or would you feel protected? Would you question his intentions? Or finally understand them? Because the truth about Adrian Cole isn't just about power or status. It's about timing, patience, and the kind of control that doesn't need to be announced to be felt. And Harper is only just beginning to see what that really means. And if you think this story is shocking, wait until you hear what happens next. Because the moment the truth fully comes to light, it won't just affect Harper and Adrian. It will send consequences back to the very people who believed they had everything under control. The Halston family made a decision they thought was safe, predictable, and easy to manage, but decisions like that have a way of coming back in ways no one expects. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more unbelievable.